We learned last week that the Goto Anything panel is an easy way to preview and open files without having to resort to a file open dialog or manually navigating around inside of the files that are open in the sidebar. Now, the Goto Anything panel draws on something we refer to as the file catalog, which is the list of files that are open inside of the sidebar. And we have a lot of powerful options that allow us to tell Sublime Text exactly what files should and should not appear in the sidebar and which ones we think should be candidates for opening via the Goto Anything panel. And that is the topic of this week's video. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odat Nerd here, and welcome to this video on controlling the contents of the sidebar and the file catalog inside of Sublime Text. Now, this is a continuation of what we covered in last week's video, which was the Goto Anything panel, which allows you to very easily navigate around within the files that you're working with inside of Sublime to be able to open those files, preview them, and things of that nature. And if you're unfamiliar with the specifics of how the Goto Anything panel works, I would urge you to go back and watch that video because we're not going to really cover that here. But we are going to do a quick little overview here of what it is we're actually talking about here. And in order to do that, we need to have some files open in the sidebar. So I'm going to use the quick switch project to quickly open my override audit project. This is something we saw in the previous video. This is the source code to my override audit Sublime Text package. We have that one folder open there. And now we'll know that we could go to the go-to menu or use the associated key binding of Control P here on Windows. It's the same on Linux. It's Command P on Mac OS to be able to open the Goto Anything panel. And this is showing us the contents of the file catalog for us to be able to navigate to one of these files. And we can use fuzzy matching just like we could in the command palette to find the file we want. So we could find the file core.py, which is in the source directory, just by typing a part of its name. So you can very easily narrow in on exactly the files that you're interested in. And of course, we have other things we can do here as well. We can apply a colon and a number to be able to jump to a specific line in a file to be able to open the file there for editing and things of that nature. If you're working with files that contain symbols, and this depends on the type of file that you're working with, so this doesn't work for plain text files, for example, you can use the @ key to see a list of the relevant symbols inside of the file you're at, and then very quickly jump to one of those if you'd like to edit there, or again, just quickly preview things. And of course, we can also use the hash marker here to be able to perform searches inside of this buffer as well. And if we press enter, we open the file, and if we push escape, the file goes away. So we can use this to open files and preview them as well. Now, the Goto Anything panel here, it's showing us files and folders. And where does it get that information from? It gets that information from something we refer to as the file catalog. And the file catalog is populated by two different things. The first of those is folders that you happen to have open in the sidebar. So here, for example, I have the override audit folder installed. So the contents of that folder are being used as part of the contents of the file catalog. The other thing that is added to the file catalog is just any file you happen to have open if it doesn't exist inside of one of those folders. So if I was to open a file from my desktop, for example, it would be open in the window, and thus it would be part of the file catalog because I'm working with it. And the Goto Anything panel wants to allow you to go through your working set of files. Now, what we see in the sidebar and what we see in the Goto Anything panel can be different in the same way that what we see in the sidebar could be different from what we see on disk if you were to actually look at these folders. And we're going to see examples of all of this in just a minute. Because on disk, you may have a lot more files and folders inside of the folders you're working with than you actually want to see here inside of Sublime. There could be folders that contain documentation that you're not interested in, or other binary files that you know you're not going to ever want to edit or look at, things of that nature. And similarly, there could be files that you want to have visualized over here in the sidebar, but you don't want them to be populated as something that you can navigate to in the Goto Anything panel, because you know you're never going to want to open a file like that. You want to have it in the sidebar to remind you it's there, to remind you of its name so that you can open it manually when you need to. But when you're just zipping through the list of files, you don't want to have those files cluttering it up. These are all things that Sublime will allow us to do. And there's a few different ways to do this. We can do this on a global level, which applies to every Sublime window everywhere. And we can also fine-tune that in on a folder folder by folder basis by using projects as well. And projects is something we have covered previously on the channel, so we're going to assume you know how those work. Go and watch that video if you're not sure how projects work in Sublime Text either. Now, we're going to be going over some of the settings here that control what does and does not appear inside of the sidebar, which is going to control largely the list of files that will appear in the Goto Anything panel. Now, one thing that we do need to know here is that when you use this @ symbol to be able to look for particular symbols in a file or symbol wide across a whole project like so, this information comes from a slightly different aspect. This is a symbol index, which is sort of based on the file catalog, because Sublime will index all of the files in the catalog that it thinks it should index to find these symbols to show them to you. But that's not something we're going to cover in this video. We're going to cover that in the next video, which is actually not going to be next week, but the week after, because next week's video is the first video on the channel where we're going to be covering how to create your own plugins and packages in Sublime Text. So stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for the video that comes after that one to get more information on how the file index works as well, so you can tune in exactly what symbols appear inside of your files. To start off with, we're going to talk about 3 settings that you can set globally in your user preferences, and these are going to modify what appears in the sidebar on a global Sublime Text basis. That means no matter what window you have open, what project you have open in any particular window, what specific settings apply inside of that project, these 3 settings will apply in all of the places. So this is the place where you would put the list of things you want to not have visible inside of files and folders ever, no matter what. And those 3 settings are the folder exclude patterns, the file exclude pattern, and the binary file patterns. Now, what do these 3 things do? As the name suggests, the folder exclude patterns is a list of folder names that you know you never want to have appear anywhere inside of any window, no matter what. And examples of that would be things like the control directories for the version control system you use if you're using a version control, or perhaps also the folder where your temporary files while you're compiling your programs go. Those are probably files you never want to be looking at inside of the sidebar as well. Those would go in there, and things of that nature. The second item, the file exclude patterns, that's a list of files that you know you never want to see in the sidebar ever. And again, these could be things like the executable files that you're generating, or debug symbol files that are created by your tools, and other intermediate files which are not interesting to you. They're interesting to the tools you're using. You don't need to see them in the sidebar. You're never going to edit them. Why even have them there in the first place? And the third item is the binary files patterns. Now, this one is a little bit of a special pattern, because if a file is marked as being a binary file, it will still appear in the sidebar, but it won't appear in Goto Anything when you use it. And if you use the Find in Files functionality, it also won't be included there. So essentially, you're telling Sublime, these are files I'd like to see in the sidebar because I want to know they're there, but I don't want to be trying to open them because they're binary files. And there are examples of all of these 3 settings, of course, in the default settings, and we're going to take a look at that now. I'm going to use View Package File to open the default preferences, which would be the left-hand pane if you were to use the Preferences Settings menu item or Command Palette entry, but this way we're just going to see that one left file so we have more room. And here in the file, I'm going to use the Goto Anything panel to jump right to line 450, which is going to take us to these 3 settings, and we can see the actual examples of what these settings look like right here. The first of these is the folder exclude patterns, which, as we can see, is a list of folders that we never want to see in the sidebar ever. And the default values for these are the control directories for Subversion, Git, Mercurial, and CVS. These are all version control systems that keep folders inside of your working copy of your source code, and they are filled up with a ton of files that you should not monkey with and you don't want to see in the sidebar. The second item in here, the file exclude patterns, these are again lists of files which by and large you probably don't want to be seeing. For example, the compiled Python bytecode for files that you're working with, or the compiled executables, DLL files, object files, and so on if you're using C or libraries. These are most definitely files that if you're using languages of that type are probably going to appear inside of the folders, but when have you ever wanted to open an executable and look at binary gibberish? Probably never, right? So that's why these are in here. And this last item is the binary files patterns. These are the files that will still show up in the sidebar, but don't appear in Goto Anything. And there's a few of these here. For example, the JPEG and PNG image file types, because perhaps you're working with a web page, you want to see the images that you have available in the sidebar so you know how to link to them, and Sublime can also view images, but you're never going to want to directly try to jump into one to modify it, for example. So those exist here in the binary files pattern setting. Now, it's important to note these are the defaults in this one. If you wanted to modify these, you could, of course, do that. You would use the preferences, settings, menu item, or command palette entry, which would give you that split window. This file would be on the left, yours would be on the right. You could add a folder exclude patterns or a file exclude patterns or a binary file patterns or any one of those into your user settings. Always remember that your settings in the right override the settings in the left. So if you want to modify any of these settings, it's in your best interest to copy the default value over to your settings first and then modify the copy to adjust things, unless you didn't want any of these defaults. Because if you decided there's a type of file that I don't want to be included and you just copied that, created a file exclude patterns with just that one file, that one type of file would go away, but all of these other ones that are here in the default would come back. So that's something to keep in mind. As our first example, if I was to use the quick switch project to go to the homepage.sublime project, this is a project that exists on my desktop, and it's a source code to my homepage, odatnerd.net. I keep this in Git, and this is in fact a Git repository. We can see down there in the status bar of the window that this is on branch master, for example. But what we don't see in the left-hand side of this thing is a .git folder. But if I was to double-click the folder over here on my desktop and have that appear, we can see there's definitely a Git folder here. There's a Git folder, an assets folder, a CGI bin folder, an override out folder. We can see 3 of those 4. We don't see the Git directory in there, and that's because that folder is in the list of default folder exclude patterns. Sublime is ignoring that for me. And of course, I haven't changed that. I don't want to look at the Git directory. So that's an example of a folder not being present here in the sidebar, even though it exists on disk. And another example of that is the homepage.sublime workspace file, because we can see here I have this project file stored inside of this. Now, one of the default settings, if again we were to go to view package file and look at the default preference settings and jump down to line 450, we'll see in the list of file exclude patterns, if I was to turn on word wrap quickly in this file, the very last thing in this list is star.sublime workspace. Those are files that are automatically excluded from the sidebar because although they are text and you could edit them, you probably don't want to. They're just Sublime's housekeeping for what you're doing in your project. And indeed, there is one in this directory, but it's not being seen over there in the sidebar. So that's an example of that as well. Now, remember, we also saw the binary file patterns. That tells Sublime when files are binary, which means that you don't want to be able to jump to them by a Goto Anything, but you still want to see them in the sidebar. And we see examples of that here. There are these PNG files. So we can see this avatar here and another one. We can click on these images and Sublime will show them to us. But if we were to not be looking at one of those files, if we were instead just looking at a text file and we decided we wanted to go into the Goto Anything panel, if we looked for PNG files, they don't exist anywhere here inside of this panel. They only exist over there in the sidebar, because those are examples of files where I want to be able to see them in the sidebar, to know they're there, so I know to link to them, what their names are, things of that nature here in a web page. I've also done this in game development as well. You want to know what your game development assets are. But very rarely have I ever been so excited by my own avatar or a picture I was posting on my blog that I wanted to just view it in Sublime Text by using the Goto Anything panel. So the default binary file patterns suits me perfectly fine in that case. For another example of this, if we were to use the quick switch project to jump to the hello world.sublime project, this is a C#.NET program, and we can see there is quite a lot of content in this thing, but probably things that we're not interested in. Now, again, if I was to double click this folder on my desktop to show what we can actually see inside of this, we can see that there is a Sublime Workspace file in this folder, but it doesn't appear over there in the sidebar, even though the Sublime project file does. And further, if I was to go into the bin directory, and then the debug directory, and then the netcore app directory, we can see there's actually a DLL file and a debug symbol file in this folder that don't appear over there in the sidebar, because those are considered to be files that are excluded. And similarly, if we jumped back to the obj directory, there's also a debug directory and a netcore app, and we can see those same two DLL files and the debug symbol files here as well, but they also don't appear over there in the sidebar. Now, those are files that are being hidden because they are never things that you want to see. These folders may or may not be examples of folders that you don't want to see on a regular basis. Here in this C# project, I probably don't want them. I'm never going to edit any of the files inside there. As a matter of fact, in a .NET C# program, the bin and obj directories will just be recreated if you delete them. But if I use Goto Anything, we can see there is a lot of content in this thing that is probably files I'm never going to be interested in looking at. But there might be an interest in having a bin directory in some other project to be able to see, say, scripts in there, for example. So this might not be something that we want to put in our global settings. Fortunately for us, Sublime allows us to use these settings on a project by project basis if we want to. And even at that, not only on a project basis, but a folder by folder basis inside of a project. If you have more than one, so you can really dial in and get exactly the customizability that you want. So let's say that here in this C# project, we don't want to see the contents of the bin and the obj directory anywhere in here at all, but we might want to see them in some other projects. We don't want to set this as a global setting. How do we do that? Well, we can do that because we have a project here. And if you're unfamiliar with how projects work in Sublime Text, there is a video on the channel. I'd recommend you go back and watch that to get the full juicy details of that, because we're not going to really cover it here. But what we are going to do is go up into the project menu here and choose edit project. We could also choose the project file down there in the sidebar, but sometimes you have the project file hidden and sometimes you don't. So this can be a handy way to make sure you always find the thing. And that's going to open this file for us. Now we can see I have one folder in here and the path is dot because it's contained inside of the same folder as the Sublime project folder is. Now, what we can actually do in here is use those folder exclude patterns, file exclude patterns, and binary file patterns settings in order to modify what is appearing here in this project, and then they'll be specific to just this and not to Sublime as a whole. Now, one caveat to this, something that catches people out, is the settings are the same as those global settings that we saw just a few minutes ago in the default settings, and they could also be in your user preferences as well. Here in a project, although you can add a settings key, those settings that we're about to use here don't go in the settings key. They apply to specific folders because Sublime is going to allow us to have any number of folders we want open in the sidebar at any time, and we can individually customize each one of them. So we could have the bin folder hidden in one folder but not in another, for example, because that provides us with extreme flexibility. So what we actually need to modify is here inside of this actual little object that represents this folder, inside of here. And what we could say is folder exclude patterns. Now I'm using package dev here to get auto completions here and better syntax highlighting in my syntax in my Sublime project rather. So I always recommend package dev. It's not just for package developers. It just makes your life in Sublime that much better. But if you don't want to use it, you could of course always type all this stuff in manually. It's not going to make any difference. Now it's going to automatically throw this up. This is going to be a list of patterns of folders we don't want to see in here. So I could, for example, type bin. And as soon as I hit save, we see the bin folder is now gone from the left-hand side. And we also wanted the object folder to be gone. So I'm going to add that as well. And now all we have in here is just those three things, the project file for C#, the Sublime project file, and our actual code. And as a matter of fact, if I was to use the Goto Anything panel where we previously saw a ton of files in here, now there's just these ones. Now, as we saw again a second ago, the Sublime workspace file is in the list of file excludes, but the Sublime project file is not, globally speaking. And I personally prefer it that way. If I have a project file in a folder, I'd like to know that folder is actually represented by a project. Other people like to do that in a different way. In this particular thing, let's say I'm not interested in knowing that, although normally I am. So I wouldn't want to fiddle with this setting in the user preferences because that would apply everywhere. But in this project, I want to do something like that. So I can easily say file exclude patterns like so. And now I can say star.sublime-project. And when I save, the Sublime project file vanishes out of the sidebar there. And again, it doesn't appear here. It only appears because this file is currently open, because remember the file catalog that shows you the files in the sidebar and files that are open. So if I was to close this file and use it, it no longer appears. But we'll go ahead and edit the project file again to bring that back. And the last thing that we could use in here if we wanted to is the binary file patterns. Now, as we know, the binary file patterns is something that tells Sublime we'd like to see this file in the sidebar, but we don't want it to be offered up in here. And an example of that might be this file. This is a C# project file. It's in use by .NET. It's, let's say, something we don't really want to accidentally be editing. So we don't want it to be here in the Goto Anything panel, but we do want to see it in the sidebar because we might want to edit it. And in the case that we do, we can always get at it from the sidebar. Well, we can actually go ahead into this file right here and add the binary file patterns is the thing we're talking about here, excuse me. And that's going to give us this list here. And this is going to, we could say in here that we want this to be star.csproj files as well. And I'm going to hit the key. Now, it still appears over there in the sidebar because binary files appear in the sidebar. But when I push this key, it's no longer in there. And as a matter of fact, if I was to close this project file again, now literally the only thing that we can edit here is our actual program code. And of course, as we add more classes to this, they would appear. We're not seeing any of those files in there that we don't really care about. We could still bring in our mouse and click on this file if we want to edit it, but we're not getting it modified here. And life is generally good. Now, something that is to note here is that this file exclude pattern, folder exclude patterns, and binary file patterns, these values here in this folder add on to the globals. They don't replace the globals in these. So whatever is globally excluded or marked as binary is still global. This is just additions to that for this specific folder here in this project. To recap what we've seen thus far, we have control over the sidebar by using the file exclude patterns, the folder exclude patterns, and the binary file pattern settings. And those settings control what appears in the sidebar. They also control how the file catalog is constructed, which controls what appears in the Goto Anything panel. So we can hide whole files and folders if we know we never want to edit them by using the exclude settings. And we can mark files as binary if we still want them to be in the sidebar, still want them to be able to be opened manually by using the sidebar, but we don't want them to be part of the catalog as part of Goto Anything. anything. And we've also seen that there's global settings for this that apply absolutely everywhere. And if we're using projects, we can use those settings on a folder by folder basis in a project to tune those in. Remember, that's always in a folder in a project, never in the settings in a project. It won't work there if you do that. You'll just confuse yourself. And even inside of a project, when you do it in the folders, the globals still apply, and then the folder options apply on top of that. And of course, there's that helpful reminder that if you ever want to modify the global settings for these in your user preferences, always copy the default value from the default settings in the left-hand pane to your user settings on the right. Never just add the setting and then adjust its value that way, because you're more than likely to forget to add something that was a default, and then you'll be very confused when suddenly files are appearing in the sidebar that you've never seen before. Now, this whole mechanism revolves around the notion that when you're working with a folder of files, most of the time you want all of the files in that thing, or a large bulk of those files anyway. There might be a few folders that contain intermediate files that you don't care about, or there might be some files that are binary that you don't want to open, but by and large, you want to see everything. Now, it can occur in some cases where you mostly want nothing except for a few files. And Sublime actually allows you to do that as well. You can sort of switch it, if you will, from its everything but this mode to and only this except mode. And in order to do that, you have to be using a project. There's not a global version of the settings we're about to discuss here. You have to be using a Sublime project file and modify this in the project specific folder settings, just like the other ones. So in order to demonstrate this, we're going to jump back into that Hello World project that we were looking at just a second ago. And remember, we've specifically told it that we want to see everything in this folder, but we don't want to see the bin folder or the obj folder, and that automatically excludes everything underneath them because Sublime never goes inside of them to see that there's anything there. We've told it we want to exclude the Sublime project file, and we want to consider the CS proj file as a binary file. So we still want to see it, but we don't want it to be available in the file catalog. And the result of that, as we can see here, is the only file that I can open is the program.cs file. Now we are seeing the Sublime project file, even though that's in the file exclude patterns. That's only because this project file is open right now. And remember, the file catalog consists of files in the sidebar and files that you have opened. And the folder exclude patterns don't apply to files that you've opened. They only apply to the sidebar over there on the side of the window. There's another way that we could do this to get the same thing by using the other mechanism for doing that. And to start with, I'm going to remove all of that so we get all of this content back here as we see before. I'll just go ahead and zoom all those out so we can see all of this file content over here in the side. Now, previously when we did this, we used the folder exclude to exclude whole folders and things of that nature. We're going to do that differently this time. We're going to use file include patterns instead. Now, this will again only work inside of a folder in a Sublime project file. This won't work in the global settings. When you use this key, you're switching Sublime from its everything in this folder except these files mode to inside this folder only include files that match this list. And if I was to add star.cs to this list, we'll see that as soon as I save this file, the things fold up again because the file catalog changed. And if I expand all of these out, all of the files are gone except for the C# files because we told Sublime to include it. So by just including this one line, we've automatically thrown away every other file of every other type. Now, you can use the include and the exclude together if you want. For example, I could say file exclude pattern star.assemblyinfo.cs like so, because this file over here, the hello app.assemblyinfo.cs, that's not something we wanted previously, and previously we excluded it by excluding the obj directory, but here we can exclude it specifically. And when you use include and then exclude, the include is used first to come up with the content that is there the default you could consider this to be is everything. And then the exclude pattern applies after that. So by saving this, again, the catalog changes. So we need to manually reopen all of these, but we can see that now that particular file is gone. And this works not only with files, but also with folders as well. You can use folder include patterns to include only specific folders. So I could say folder include patterns like so. And we could say, for example, bin. Now, we only want to see the bin directory, and that's going to make the object directory and everything under it go away. And as soon as I hit that, again, that is the case. The bin directory is here, but only the bin directory is here. The content of that isn't actually in here anymore. Now, one of the other folders that was in here was debug, and there was actually two debug folders. There was one in the bin folder and there was one in the obj folder. When I add this to the include patterns, we'll see that it's here in the bin folder. The debug folder is here, but in the obj folder, it's not. And again, that's because we specifically told Sublime to only include the bin folder. So when it saw the obj folder, it said, I don't need to see inside of this. I haven't been told to include this. As a result, it doesn't get to see that there's a debug folder inside of that thing. So using this mechanism, if you wanted to mostly exclude files and only keep a few of them, you have the power to do that as well. Whether we're working with ad hoc folders or dedicated projects, our ability to constrain what is and is not visible in the sidebar and what is and is not presented to us for navigation in the Goto Anything panel is of paramount importance in allowing us to ignore the things we don't care about so we can focus in on the things that we do. And hopefully this information is informative and it's going to make your life in Sublime Text a little bit more sublime. And if that's the case, please do use those buttons down below to show your support, including subscribing if you'd like to know when the next video becomes available, because remember, next week is going to be the first video on creating your own packages and plugins in Sublime Text. But that's all I have for this week. So as always, remember, if you have any questions, comments, requests for clarification, or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics you'd like to see me cover in a future video, drop that good stuff down in the comment section below. And until the next video, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.